Hello, and thank you so much to the ICJ for giving me this opportunity to speak to you in my capacity as UN independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism. I'm just going to share my screen, and while I do that, I want to take the time to apologize for not being with you in person to make this presentation due to my very busy schedule. But I'm grateful, as I've mentioned, to the ICJ for giving me this opportunity to share my presentation. I'll be looking at ensuring access to justice for persons with albinism in Africa, and I will also try and make these slides available so that they can be shared. When we talk about access to justice, people look at it from different lenses, but I wanted to highlight that I'll quickly be looking at access to justice in relation to attacks, as well as access to justice in relation to violations of economic, social, and cultural rights. It's also very important to look at accessibility of justice systems when we talk about access to justice. So the relevant treaties, as you know, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which not only deals with justice, but also deals with other rights that are relevant for attacks, like the right to be free from torture, right to human dignity, and the like. When we talk about access to justice for violation of economic, social, and cultural rights, ATESCA obviously applies. And then in relation to women, CEDAW will apply, and in relation to children, the CRC. Um, People may not always recognize that attacks against persons with albinism and discrimination against persons with albinism is mainly due to the difference in coloring of that person compared to the rest of the population. The International Covenant on Elimination of Racial Discrimination deals not only with race, but also distinction based on color. And therefore, ICED also applies to cases of attacks and violations of ESCR rights of persons with albinism. As we know, albinism is a disability, and therefore the CRPD applies. And the Convention Against Torture also applies because attacks against persons with albinism are seen as forms of torture where the state is unable or unwilling to respond to these and to provide just access to justice for people, for victims. And the state is seen to be acquiescing in this case. We also apply the trafficking protocol because where people are moved by deceit or fraud, one of those kind of dishonest means for the purposes of exploitation, and exploitation in this case meaning the removal of an arm or a leg or murder so that their body parts can be used in ritual, then this constitutes trafficking. We often think of trafficking only in the content of trafficking for labor or for sexual exploitation, but it also includes trafficking for any form of exploitation, and this therefore fits. At the African level, there's, of course, the African Charter, the Maputo Protocol when it comes to women, and the African Charter on the Rights of the Child when it comes to children, as well as the African Disability Protocol. I'll say more about the later. Um, Obstacles in accessing justice for attacks, there are quite a number. First, lack of appropriate laws or failure to implement or apply appropriate laws. So, for example, in Zambia, there is no law that prohibits the possession of human body parts. So, where a person is found in a possession of the body part of a person with albinism, they cannot be prosecuted for that because there is no law. And it was the same in Malawi until recently, until some years ago, and there's now a law that was amended so that that is covered. Uh, in other cases, the laws are there, but they're just not implemented or applied in cases of attack. So I mentioned trafficking, and there are cases where trafficking laws are not applied in relation to persons with albinism. Attitudinal barriers in the community, stigma and discrimination against persons with albinism, the superstitions and wrong beliefs about albinism may also lead to um, obstacles, may also become obstacles to accessing justice. You may find that community members are unwilling to come forward when they've seen an attack, unwilling, to be witnesses. They may actually believe the superstitions, so they may fear also being attacked or having some kind of reparation, or they may just, acquiesce or feel that a person with albinism, believe the stereotypes they hear about persons with albinism and therefore not see the need to actually respond and support someone with albinism. We've also seen in some contexts where members of the community discourage someone with albinism from reporting or other victims from reporting crimes and try and encourage them to forgive rather than access justice. Um, and we also have to remember that agents of the justice sector, the police, prosecutors, judges, magistrates, whoever they may be, are also members of the community. They also come with their own attitudinal barriers, unconscious bias, and therefore those attitudinal, those superstitions and unconscious bias may also form barriers for accessing justice for persons with albinism. And for example, there may be a lack of willingness to investigate attacks if they're police officers. At the same time, there are times when there's just a lack of capacity to investigate. And capacity means, how do you carry out forensic investigations? How do you gather appropriate investigation in order to prosecute a case? This may also lead to challenges in obtaining evidence. We'll notice in some countries that police solely depend on witnesses to provide evidence for prosecution. And as I've mentioned, witnesses may be unwilling or afraid to come forward, especially when there's no witness protection programs, and therefore it may be harder to obtain evidence. Also, like where there's no fingerprint database, no other form of forensic investigation, crime scene investigation, it makes it difficult to obtain any evidence. When it comes to prosecutions as well, we've also seen the use of sentences that are not commensurate with crime. The courts may fail to take into account aggravating factors, including the fact that attacks against persons with albinism would constitute a hate crime because they're carried out on the basis of the color of a person with albinism. And therefore, they do not see this as an aggravating circumstance. And also, they may use charges against some perpetrators of these crimes that carry very low charges. So, for example, in Zambia, we saw somebody who was convicted, who could have been convicted of attempted kidnapping, being convicted only of trespassing, which carries a sentence of 6 months. And before we knew it, the person was out. When it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights, lack of understanding of their own rights by persons with albinism may also lead to a lack of access, may also constitute an obstacle to accessing justice. Persons with albinism may not understand that how they're being treated is a violation of their rights, and therefore may not pursue justice in that regard. In some cases, albinism is not recognized as a disability, and therefore, even if there is a disability law that provides protection, this is not used to ensure, the enforcement of economic, social, and cultural rights. There may also be a lack of appropriate mechanisms for redress or poor capacity of these mechanisms. And by that, I'm also referring to not just the civil courts, but also the national human rights institutions, public protectors, any employment tribunal, for example, employment body that's set up to look at unfair dismissals. And therefore, these bodies may not have the appropriate capacity to carry out this, and this may constitute an obstacle to accessing justice. In fact, in some countries, even the courts may not have, lack justiciability. So in some cases, economic, social, and cultural rights are not justiciable in courts, and therefore these rights cannot be protected even in like constitutional courts or human rights courts. This is the case in Zambia at the moment, for example, where economic, social, and cultural rights are not seen as justiciable, although the courts have found ways of still, human rights organizations, activists have found ways of still prosecuting these cases using civil and political rights. Justice systems may not be accessible, maybe financially. There are payments that have to be made, and persons with albinism tend to be amongst the poorest in society and may not be able to afford these financial constraints, even in cases where it should be the state taking the case forward. The format of documentation, they need to be large print, high contrast for persons with albinism, and this may not be the case. The accessibility of the building themselves, going to court. In some cases, people may have to wait outside in the sun for long periods, or wait inside with the sun, on the entering and maybe blinding them or on their face in a sense, exposing them more to the risk of skin cancer. But not just that as well. We're talking about the floors. Albinism comes with low vision as well, so there may be a need for tactile floors, accessible signage, and this is not always available. And as I've mentioned as well, the attitudinal barriers or the lack of understanding of albinism as a disability and therefore the failure to implement reasonable accommodations. I spoke to judges who said that they didn't understand that albinism comes with low vision and therefore sometimes thought that if someone with albinism was not telling the truth because they couldn't identify the perpetrator, or they did not understand nystagmus and therefore felt that someone with albinism was being a bit dishonest because of the movement of their eyes. So these also may also impact on access to justice. The Africa Disability Protocol, as I mentioned, is quite unique in the sense that it specifically recognizes albinism and the attacks against persons with albinism in the preamble. It recognizes harmful practices as being based on, superstition and how it impacts on persons with disabilities. And then it also calls for measures against these harmful practices. And these superstitions, these harmful practices, are the reasons why persons with albinism are attacked. So Article 4 calls on states to take measures against harmful practices. Article 11 calls on states to take measures to support and assist persons affected by harmful practices, including through measures to discourage stereotyped views. What has been the response of the mandate in relation to access to justice? We've carried out research, and I'm saying we because I'm including myself and my predecessor. So research has been carried out to better understand the specific global and sometimes country context, so that we can make appropriate recommendations on how to ensure access to justice in these situations. This has been done through, for example, a Human Rights Council report my predecessor wrote on access to justice. We always do this in our country visit reports around access to justice, particularly where we have seen attacks, such as Madagascar and Mozambique. And we've also done some specialized reports. So these are reports that are not actually required by the UN, and they're not falling within the UN OHCHR system, but have been carried out specifically into issues. So, for example, we recently launched a report on access to justice for persons with albinism in Zambia. There was a report on in the UK, persons with albinism in the UK, which looked mainly at economic, social, and cultural rights. And the Albinism Worldwide report also looks at issues here. So awareness raising as well, the dissemination of research findings. We do this through engagement with states, media interviews, social medias. You may have seen our videos that summarize the finding of the reports and help digest this easily. We carry out capacity building of albinism groups and individuals to help them better understand their rights and how to demand these rights. Capacity building of the justice sector through workshops, seminars, roundtable discussions, and also exchanges with persons with albinism. Because what we've seen is that some members of the justice sector have actually never interacted with someone with albinism. So we have to carry out these engagements. At the regional and international level, we've also been engaging with other committees and other human rights bodies, such as the CRPD committee, the African Committee on the Elimination of the Rights, African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And they had a day of general discussion last year on children with albinism. They've also just recently adopted a guidance note on reporting on children with albinism. We have the Pan-African Parliament guidelines on harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks, which provides recommendations on how to end this, as well as ensuring access to justice for harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. At the UN level, there's a similar resolution as well on harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. And there was a study done on this as well. I work with a network of groups working on witchcraft, accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks known as INAWA, and we've carried out a number of joint activities around highlighting the PAP guidelines and the UN resolution as well as the study. My predecessor worked to get the African Commission to adopt the Regional Action Plan on Albinism, and this was superseded by the AU Plan of Action on Albinism. And these also provide recommendations on how to ensure access to justice. There's also been a proposal for the establishment of an AU envoy on albinism as well, who can also help in this regard. So that was a very quick whirlwind. Thank you so much for your giving me the time and listening. If you would like to reach out to learn more about the work that I'm doing, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn on those handles over there. And this are my website and my email address in case you'd like to get in touch and if you have any more questions. Thank you very much. And if you do have questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch. I wish you all a very good conference. Thank you.